Alright, guys, I'm back with On Infertile Ground. The population crisis returns. In 2010, Mother Jones magazine ran a special issue with the cover asking, quote, "Who's to blame for the population crisis?" End quote. Inside the issue's lead article, quote, "The last taboo, what unites the Vatican, lefties, conservatives, environmentalists, and scientists in a conspiracy of silence?" End quote, centered on a crowd thronging the streets of Calcutta late one night. Quote, "It's midnight on the streets of Calcutta. Old women cook over open fires on the sidewalks. Men wait in line at municipal hand pumps to lather skin, hair, lungus, skirts, bathing without undressing. Girls sit in the open beds of bicycle-powered trucks, braiding their hair. Grandfathers, under umbrellas, squat on their heels, arguing over card games, while mothers hold bore-bottom toddlers over open latrines. Many people sleep through the lively darkness, draped over sacks of rice or on work carts full of paper or rags or hay. Groups of men and women, far from their home villages, sprawl haphazardly through the sidewalk, snoring." What is... Go away. Rather than a conspiracy of silence, a review of media and popular writing at the turn of the millennium reveals just the opposite. In fact, the Mother Jones issue appeared in the midst of a veritable explosion of articles, blog posts, journal publications, and think pieces linking women's fertility, global population growth, and the environment. From 2005 and 2008, writing that cited the terms, quote, "population growth" and, quote, "environment" and or "climate change" increased fourfold. Like Mother Jones magazines began to publish special issues, an entire series dedicated to the issue. Scientific American's population issue in summer 2009 claimed that Malthusian limits are back and squeezing us painfully, end quote. While the next year, National Geographic initiated a year-long series focused on population growth and environmental consequences, titled, quote, "State of the Earth 2010, with striking glossy images of people around the world farming, fishing, driving cars, extracting minerals, and thronging the streets, juxtaposed with the pictures of denuded, heavily plowed or constructed earth. The images told a gripping story of a planet sagging under the weight of human activity. And in 2011, after the United Nations published global population projections, the New York Times responded by publishing articles and blogs detailing the ways ongoing population growth would intensify demands on the global food supply, colliding with limiting factors like climate change, water scarcity, and land shortages. Increasingly, these writings focus on climate change. A 2015 editorial in Los Angeles Times argued that, quote, "Sensitive subject or not, the reality is that unsustainable human population growth is a potential disaster for efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions," end quote. While the Huffington Post reported that, quote, "Access to voluntary birth control will cut our collective human carbon footprint," end quote. Specialized scientific reports have also taken up this theme, with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, a transnational body of climate scientists and policy actors, stating in its 2014 assessment report that, quote, "Globally, economic and population growth continue to be the most important drivers of increased CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion." If population growth is a secret, it is an open one, yet the language of scarce secrecy and taboo continue to predominate. Collectively, the majority of the recent population environment writing is focused on two central themes: population interventions as secret, controversial, or overlooked, but necessary solutions to environmental problems, and the mutual social and environmental benefits of supporting women's universal voluntary access to Western contraceptives. These writings insist that while taboo population must be addressed if we are collectively going to make progress on climate change, and equally important, that increasing women's access to contraceptives as a climate mitigation strategy is empowering to women. Moreover, this argument has also been taken up by prominent Western feminists, including Hillary Clinton, Gloria Steinem, and Mary Robinson, all of whom have advocated family planning and population stabilization as a necessary woman-centered climate change strategy. Behind the scenes, a different story emerges. In international development, the arena that has turned the rhetoric of population problems into intervention programs and policies, population and family planning have lost the prominence they once enjoyed. Development actors speak often of the disappearance of population in comparison to the days when its role in international development and foreign policy seemed unshakable. Where was population before and where did it go? Why is it, quote, coming back now? This chapter explores the historical and contemporary reasons for the supposed silence and reemergence of population in public. Um, it begins with an exploration of the history of global population control and the resulting feminist activism that resulted in a dramatic transformation of international population policy. It then explores the often invisible role of funding by documenting the role of private and public sector donors in mobilizing resources and securing new strategies to restore it. Finally, I close with a discussion of why climate change is such an immediate way to bring population back to public debate, and why this approach is particularly dangerous. Alright, the American roots of population control. In 1954, Hugh Moore, founder of Dixie Cup and the population activist, wrote a pamphlet called, quote, The Population Bomb, and began distributing it through mass mailing, eventually reaching over 1.5 million people. Over those people was General William Draper, who led a commissioned study on U.S. military aid for then President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Draper invited population experts to brief his staff, and at the end of the commission's work, they wrote a report calling for the U.S. government to fund interventions in maternal and child welfare overseas, which, although not explicitly stated, included contraception. This marked a turn in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, one in which rapid population growth was now officially marked as a security issue, and birth control was seen as a part of the national defense. Draper and Moore formed the Population Crisis Committee, later renamed Population Action International, using it as a platform to advocate the necessity of population control in international aid. Draper, Moore, and the committee were not motivated by humanitarian or public health concerns, but rather Cold War concerns about the spread of communism. Moore's pamphlet was based on Washington's anxieties over the spread of communism in rapidly growing nations of the global South, fears that they were closely aligned with concerns about continued access to raw materials, labor, and markets in nations gaining independence from colonialism. The bomb he referred to symbolized the potential for rapid population growth in the Third World to have the same kind of explosive and devastating effect on Earth as a nuclear bomb. Demographers were critical of this approach. They argued that it was dangerous to go with the offensive and potentially controversial proposition that population control in the global South should be used as a tool to counter the spread of communism. Moreover, Moore was unmoved. He wanted to influence business and government elites as well as the general public. Population control efforts were underway across newly independent nations in the global South, led both by state governments and international donors, with the U.S. government playing a prominent role. International agencies began to tie food aid and government loan packages to contraceptive distribution schemes. In the mid-1960s, the U.S. government under Lyndon B. Johnson began to produce and circulate experimental contraceptives intended for mass distribution across India, including over 1 million intrauterine devices. Promotional incentives such as cash payments and radios were used as part of a carrot and a stick incentives for community-based contraceptive providers. with support from Indian government. After Indira Gandhi took the reins of power in India's government in 1966, she immediately intensified population control efforts across the country. Doctors were given bonus payments in exchange for reaching targets for IUD insertions and surgical sterilizations. Non-clinical practitioners were paid per service, with vasectomies paying out double the price for the IUD insertion. Between 1966 and 1967, 1.8 million Indians were implanted with IUDs or sterilized, a number that would increase dramatically a decade later under India's national emergency period. During the emergency family planning became um, during the emergency family planning became integrated into all government offices activities. Cash payments to IUD and sterilization acceptors increased more than tenfold, and compulsory sterilization was introduced as a component of state policy, often enacted in sterilization camps with 1 year more than 8 million sterilizations, including 6.2 million vasectomies and 2.05 million tubal ligations were inducted primarily among the poor. Again, it's fine if it's for rape or incest, reasons for their safety, but my guess is they weren't all for that reason. Okay. As historian Matthew Connolly's comprehensive study of global population control demonstrates, while India is a particularly egregious case, it is not entirely unique in the history of global population control. Food and Agricultural Organization aid distribution in Haiti became tied to contraceptive incentive programs, and the governments of India, Singapore, and Indonesia denied housing tax and other benefits to parents who had more than two children. Uh, by the early 1980s, Bangladesh was the largest recipient of international population assistance, and as a result, the state imposed harsh punitive measures on those who refused family planning efforts. In one particularly horrifying example, members of the Bangladesh army rounded up hundreds of people for forcible sterilization, and food aid from the World Food Program was denied to Bangladesh flood victims who refused to be sterilized. This is not to suggest that women in the global south were not interested in birth control. Okay, thank you for pointing that out. However, even when they did attempt to secure access to contraceptives voluntarily, the lack of consistent service delivery, comprehensive options, and education about methods and their side effects often formed a formidable barrier. Okay, so they wanted to be the ones to do it to them, but they're not allowed to do it themselves. That's, of course, alright, typical. The emphasis on family planning in aid programs often helped deepen poverty in already struggling nations, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa, where U.S. foreign aid in the 1980s was predicated on countries adopting structural adjustments programs tied to population control. Connolly refers to the 20th century escalation of global population control as a, quote, system without a brain, characterized by policies and other interventions that gained a momentum of their own. Population control seemed to be a machine that ran itself, and it was running amok. At the time, population had long been a site of international struggle in the developing policy arena. While population control had been central to the American international development agenda from the late 1950s, leaders in global South countries at the time resisted this approach. In 1974, even when the first World Population Conference was convened in Bucharest, many leaders rejected population control imposed by the North, arguing that it was a distraction from the inequalities underlying the international economic order. Instead, they pointed out the long shift in Europe from high population growth rates to very low growth, arguing that economic and social progress was responsible, not population control. Accordingly, they developed the slogan, "Development is the best contraceptive." Within 10 years, however, many leaders' positions had shifted. At the 1984 World Population Conference in Mexico City, leaders from the Global South argued that their conference in Mexico City, leaders from the Global South argued that their resources could not support unrestricted population growth whereas the U.S. under Reagan adopted a neutral position on population growth, arguing that the slow economic development in the global South was attributable to much state intervention, not demographic changes. The best contraceptive, according to Reagan's administration, was the free market. Why such a reversal? The answer had less to do with actual questions of population and development, and more to do with the rising influence of religious fundamentalism in the U.S. In the early 1980s, a well-organized group of pro-life advocates who were key to Reagan's base support had begun pressing for three things: defunding and dismantling the Population Office at the U.S. Agency for International Development, using population funds to support natural family planning, and sending a pro-life delegation to 1984 World Population Conference in Mexico City. Natural family planning. What the hell does that mean? I guess we'll find out. In response to this picture, the U.S. sent a delegation with a neutral position on population growth. At the conference, they argued that the free market provided a solution to social problems like poverty and inequality, and that family planning alone could not address these issues effectively. Abortion could not address them at all. As a result, the Reagan administration withdrew support from any organization providing abortion services, information, or referrals. This began known as the Mexican City Policy, also known as the Global Gag Rule. In this context, the Mexico City Conference, quote, marked the moment when the population growth was no longer treated as a population problem requiring a global solution, end quote. By the time of the next World Population Conference at Cairo in 1994, the terms of the global population debate had shifted once again, this time to focus on the role of population in producing environmental problems, and, as the next section will demonstrate, the policy document produced at the Cairo conference reflected a perspective that had never been formally enshrined in international population policy. A focus on women's right to healthy sexuality, reproduction, and autonomous bodily decision making. The roots of sexual stewardship, Rio, Cairo, and women's embodied environmental responsibility. Feminist organizing for the 1994 International Conference on Population and Development, also known as the Cairo Conference, began years before the conference. In preparation for the 1992 UN Conference on Environmental and Development in Rio, also known as the Earth Summit, activists gathered to outline their position and organize strategy. The Women's Environment and Development Organization convened a 1991 meeting of over 1,000 women activists from 90 countries who gathered in Miami to discuss the, quote, women's dimension of the global environmental crisis. Unlike neo-Malthusians, the feminists at the conference decentered population from the debate, instead focusing on global economic crisis, third world debt, and the impacts of nuclear testing and other military operations on land, wildlife, and human health across the globe. A central theme of the conference was that these effects were gendered, in that they disproportionately impact women's bodies and livelihoods. They also focused on political dimensions, specifically the fact that women were drastically underrepresented in decision-making bodies that made global environmental policy. The following year, at the UNCED meetings, debates about the role of population growth emerged in an area of conference's non-official NGO forum known as the Women's Tent, Planeta Femia. The tent was co-organized and hosted by the Brazilian Women's Coalition and WEDO, and offered a program of daily workshops and presentations structured around drafting a population treaty and a separate women's treaty. By the time negotiations had concluded, coalition's actors, led by Southern anti-Malthusians and Northern feminists, firmly rejected inclusion of population control as the component of international environmental development, opting instead for the critical focus on northern consumption practices and advocating for developmental approaches favoring women's comprehensive sexual and reproductive health care. The document produced from these debates is known as the Treaty on Population, Environment, and Development. It asserts that, quote, women's empowerment to control their own lives is a foundation for all action linking population, environment, and development, end quote, and explicitly rejected all forms of control over women's body by government and international institutions, including coerced sterilization, experimental contraceptive development, and denial of access to abortion. Well, that's cool that it's looking out for both sides of the situation. Okay. Although the document located the drives of global environment and militarism, debt, structural adjustment, inequitable trade policies, and patterns of consumption and production in the industrialized North, it did not. It didn't. It did mention. It did include mention of population. However, this mention of population was in sharp contrast to prevailing arguments, focusing on resource consumption in the global North. In the preamble, the treaty's authors stated that they, quote, affirm the support women's health and reproductive rights and their freedom to control their bodies, end quote. An approach which demanded, quote, the empowerment of women half of the world's population to exercise free choice and the right to control their fertility and to plan their families, end quote. The document made clear that population was not central to discussions of global south environmental development and poverty reduction. Aside from critical analysis, uh, oh, sorry, aside from a critical analysis of the role of northern populations' consumption patterns in producing degradation, some of the language from the treaty became the basis for negotiations among diverse actors, neo-Malthusians, feminist activists, women's health advocates, population controllers, environmentalists, and others, in preparation for the 1994 International Conference on Population and Development at Cairo. In the lead up to Cairo, feminist activists from the global south were concerned with ensuring that language on women's empowerment, sexual health, and reproductive self determination would be included in the upcoming negotiations. Unlike the treaty produced in the Women's Health Tent, uh, the document coming out of the ICPD meeting at Cairo would be enshrined as formal international policy governing how population interventions would be devised moving forward. The stakes were very high. Reproductive health activists situated contraceptives as one component in a broader constellation of reproductive health services for women, including maternal and child health care, cancer prevention, abortion access, and post abortion care, and STD prevention and treatment. Quote, women's rights principles and respect for bodily integrity and security of the person, end quote, were also central to the framework, which offered a, quote, groundbreaking consensus among feminists and the international community, going well beyond the basic needs approach historically advanced by policymakers in the South. Reproductive rights became the central framework for their advocacy efforts, situated within a broader context of needs focused on women's health across the lifespan, and not just the reproductive years. By the time the ICPD meetings began, women in the South were a leading and majority presence in transnational feminist organizations for the conference, and they had articulated a framework that situated sexual and reproductive health in a context of human rights and global economic policies. Health was integrated as a component of broader development agenda focused on international debt, structural adjustment, and state investments in basic needs. All right, I'll be back, guys. I have to go to bed.